Good morning. Welcome to the Telecom Exchange CEO Roundtables, both for our guests here at Telecom Exchange NYC and for our viewers joining us on RCR-TV and JSATV. Our second panel today is on network security, both in 2017 and beyond. And we're very honored to have my friend, Evan Kirstel, social media business strategist and advisor for ucstrategies.com, but really the #1 social media influencer in our industry. So it's truly and I'm not just saying it, there's actually folks who survey these things and tell us as well. So it is our honor. He brings 20+ years of sales, alliances, and biz dev experience in the communications and infrastructure applications. And if you're like me, you're one of his over 126,000 Twitter followers of Evans, if last count is right. He's probably grown that since I checked it a couple of days ago. He's a top Twitter and LinkedIn influencer in our space, and if you're also like me, you're retweeting all of his amazing research and social content, particularly on network security, which makes him a perfect moderator for our esteemed panelists. So please go ahead and welcome social influencer, my friend, Mr. Evan Kirstel.
Wow, what an introduction. I've never been introduced that way before. That's awesome. Thank you. You know, when I tell people what I do for a living as a social media influencer, I get very strange and quizzical looks. And so it requires some clarification maybe afterwards exactly what I do. But I was once called the George Takei of the telecom world, so I wasn't sure if that was an insult or a compliment, but I'll take it. Whatever, a little odd maybe, but interesting nonetheless, I hope. So today's panel, a really esteemed group of individuals, and really timely because security and cybersecurity are top of mind as individuals, as consumers, as business people. And there isn't a day that goes by that there isn't, you know, a top-of-the-fold headline around a data breach or a DDoS attack or some other cybersecurity incident. It's permeated every aspect of our life, including things like politics now. So this panel is really a high-profile and excellent group of individuals to talk about, you know, a few points of view in the industry. So we'll start on my left. It'd be great to introduce yourself, but I'd like to understand what keeps you up at night in terms of a professional in this space around cybersecurity and security topics. You know, what are you worried about? What do you fear the most? And if we could start maybe with a brief introduction and go from there.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nazar Ahmad. I'm part of the network team at Facebook. Essentially, we worry about the production network that Facebook runs to support Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, Oculus, things like that. There's a number of services under that. And also focus on a little bit of the more on the R&D side of building technologies to have broadband widely available across the globe as well. So there's a lot of work we're doing on the access side for technology development. In terms of what keeps me up at night, it's kind of interesting that we're on the security panel. I'll give you a quick short story. A long time ago, we did a red team exercise. We invited a bunch of people to try to hack in. And the key takeaway out of that for me was you're never secure. You're always only a little further away from being hacked. So it's something that is really unnerving, that you'll never be done in terms of feeling secure. And you just need to make sure that we're continuing to invest in security infrastructure, security technologies, especially detection and mitigation. You have to constantly invest in it. You'll never feel secure. So that's a really unnerving feeling for somebody who runs an infrastructure for a site like Facebook, which has a lot of data. You just never feel like you're done.
Great. That was really interesting. Leo?
Thank you. So I'm Leo Taddeo. I'm the CISO for Cyxtera. Previous to my role at Cyxtera, I was the special agent in charge of the FBI's New York Cyber Division. So I got to see the adversary from a couple of perspectives. So if you ask what keeps me up at night is building a security program that's focused on yesterday's vulnerabilities and yesterday's adversaries. It's very hard to anticipate what the next generation of attacks is going to look like and what our infrastructure will do when attacked. So we spend a lot of money fighting the last war, and I wonder sometimes if it's totally wasted. And I'll give you an example. When you look at the Sony breach of 2014, the Sony Pictures Entertainment was focused on protecting motion pictures that had not yet been distributed, and they thought those were their crown jewels, and that's where the potential risk was. And what they failed to realize was that the real risk to the company was in the information in some sensitive emails. So you could, from Sony's point of view, make another movie and recover the losses if you lost the movie, but what you couldn't do very easily was recover relationships, for example, with the artists that make the movies. So the attackers in that case understood better than the defenders what was really of value, and Sony, for all it spent on security, because if you remember, they were breached in 2011 and many times in between those breaches. So they had a very expensive and robust security apparatus, but they were defending against the adversary and with a perspective that was out of date. So that's my fear, is that we don't truly understand what's coming.
Thanks, that was very helpful. George, as a telco, you have a 24/7 service expectation. So I know what keeps you up at night, but in particular relative to cyber security, cyber attacks on infrastructure, what are you most worried about?
Okay, well, first of all, just to introduce myself, I'm the CTO at WireIE, and our company is a wholesale network operator, and we focus on underserved markets. So we extend private secure networks into remote markets for our carrier customers. And what keeps me up at night, with our own internal networks, really is the people and the psychology of our people, our employees. We can put all kinds of technology, detection, and prevention to try and block these intrusions from coming into our network. But at the end of the day, people are people, and they're going to get tricked into clicking on a link or posting something on a social media site that can be used to penetrate a network.
Yeah, social media is now the new battle zone for cybersecurity. Laurent, maybe an introduction, and also what not only worries you, but also your customers who are working with you in a collaborative way.
Yeah, thank you. Very happy to be here. So my name is Laurent. I'm one of the founders of Zenedge. So we are a cybersecurity company. We provide protection against networks and applications. Here's the problem I have when you ask me this question is, what keeps me up at night is never the same thing. And that's, I think, Leo said it very well, and you did as well, is as a vendor, as a provider of cybersecurity solution, we have to play one step ahead. And it's really hard to play one step ahead when you're still trying to catch up on many subjects. So I'll just give you an example. We see a lot of attacks happening these days on APIs. And API security is probably one of the least well understood and well protected way communication between machine to machine, but it's also communication between your phone on your application and the backend server of the application you're trying to access to. And we see a lot of very disturbing activities on the traffic on APIs or in general between bot versus human traffic. And we see a lot of different examples of this, and we see bots that behave like humans. They're really hard to catch because they really look like a person behind the screen or behind the app. But in fact, it's a machine you're fighting against. And then we also see humans that behave like bots. And that's a nightmare because if you have a very solid bot protection, you're able to identify, hey, this is not a real person because of this behavior, but it happened to be, it's a real person, usually sitting in an emerging country that, from 9 to 5, that is going to a site and copy data and then try to sell this data to someone else. So bot management, identifying bot with behaviors is very hard to do. And it's even harder when there is no real expected person behind the screen when you're talking of API security or machine to machine. And we have a lot of examples on this, but this is really what we see right now as something that is a bit scary. Application protection is well understood. There are a lot of providers that know how to prevent data breaches on applications. API security is much harder to do it.
Thanks, that was helpful. I'd love to come back and talk about some specific examples. I've heard some terrifying ones from your team around attacks that are directed towards things like e-commerce sites and airlines that are very specifically focused on disrupting revenue.
Yeah, so we have one case, and it's a customer. It's an airline. And this is what happened to this customer. So they have about 1% of their revenue come from China. They are in Southeast Asia. But 60% of their cancellation come from China. And so this is really weird, right? So 60% of canceling a ticket is Chinese-based, and 1% of China is their revenue. Something is wrong. And so we looked at it, and we looked at the behavior of these users. And we find out 24 hours a day, these are people, we think, going to a site, booking a plane ticket, waiting 24 hours and canceling it. So what happened is, well, the plane gets full as bots are booking the tickets. So the remaining seats are expensive because that's how yield management works for airline. And therefore, during this time, the low-cost airline, the competition, is selling tickets like crazy because they are cheaper. Right? So security is not always about, hey, I'm going to steal your information. I'm going to steal your credit cards and numbers and your healthcare records. It's also about hurting your business by inappropriate use of a website. But we want people to buy tickets, right? So how do you make sure that, hey, no, this is not a real one? So we look at the behavior. We could catch them. They are all from Shenzhen. It's outside of Hong Kong. It's in mainland China. It's a few IP addresses. We know who they are. They know that we know who they are because they can't buy tickets anymore. And it's a game. Obviously, this is a group that was hired by, we think, some competition. They don't make money themselves. They make money by the consulting that they provide or the service they provide to buy tickets. And we could catch them because of their unusual way of behavior. These are same person or same entity that is doing repeated tasks all day long, changing IPs, changing everything all the time, but still repetitive. And that's how we could catch them. And sorry, guys, you can't buy tickets anymore if you're in China.
It's funny you describe it as a game that's not so funny. So speaking of which, Najam, Facebook, obviously the biggest social network in the world, you must be an extraordinary target of attacks. How has the evolution of these attacks taken place and the sophistication and the nature of the attacks? What have you seen from your perspective?
Well, one interesting fact, we're under attack right now. So we're attacked about 100% of the time. Something is going on. It's essentially you see the attacks on several different fronts, and it's not one specific thing. I think the attack on the network infrastructure itself is actually have diminished, and I think it's not big returns for people. But it really depends on which actors you're dealing with, and we essentially see all of them. There's some that are just trying to prove something to get in. The others are trying to take over some machines or trying to get to data, or some are really trying to cause other infrastructure or denial of service type environment. So we see essentially the whole gamut of things. And as I said, the infrastructure ones are the sort of relatively easy ones because those scenarios are relatively well understood and good defenses against that. It's the things that Laurent was talking about, looking at the broader set of information that we have as an infrastructure, everything from APIs down to the network device that's carrying those bits, and having the ability to have detection across. And it's I think it's going to lead into more of a how we think about those things, because one of the fundamental things that we have been trying to change is instead of the security being implemented via a platform or a device, we're really looking at security as a collection of a lot of data and a lot of analytics that we can do on top, and we're essentially looking for patterns. So when I say a lot of data, it's essentially picking data from any platform and any service and anything that we build, from APIs to hardware that we deploy on the network side or the servers, things like that. So getting the entire stack of network and systems involved and have that data set available and then be able to do a lot of compute on it to detect patterns. So this is the advantage that we do have is that, we have a lot of software engineers as well, so we can actually have machine learning type people work on building an analysis of what we're actually seeing and pick out the little patterns. And the hardest ones are the 1 or 2 trickle that come in. Somebody that does a brute force attack, that's sort of usually easy. But the 1 or 2 or 3 things that happen quietly, those are the ones that we need to kind of pick out. And it could be at any level. And that sort of kind of leads into how security is implemented and how we think about security.
Interesting. So Leo, we've heard the scale and the velocity of attacks are increasing. What about sophistication back from when you were in the FBI through the present day? What have you noticed about the sophistication of the attacks and even the attackers, perhaps?
Yeah, there's no doubt that sophistication at every level is increasing. So down from the hobby hacker all the way to the nation state, it's certainly an increase in sophistication. And what we've seen even just recently with WannaCry and others is the adoption of what were nation-state tools to criminal purposes, or perhaps nation-state purposes, which is possible in that case. So there is a proliferation of tools and talent that is exploding. We have organizations today that are investing in research and development for their hacking talent. They are farming within criminal communities to find talent. So I'll give you an example. Recently in the Yahoo breach, there was an indictment that accused 2 Russian intelligence officers of aiding criminal hackers in two areas, according to the indictment. One is in enriching themselves in a criminal sense with a scheme to enrich themselves. The other was using the hackers to advance authorized regime-sanctioned hacking activity. And so when you can meld the capabilities of a nation state with the criminal groups, you naturally will have an advance in the capabilities of the criminal groups. And it's a vicious cycle that is to the detriment of defenders. So I think the bottom line for us is we are no longer facing a spectrum of attackers. We're pretty much focused on the high end of sophistication and capability at all times. And that's because criminal groups have adopted nation-state tools and techniques, and nation-states have masked their own activity behind criminal group identities. And that's been borne out in a number of cases. So what does it mean for defenders? It means for defenders that we used to take a risk-based approach where we looked at our adversaries, tried to determine the motives, tried to determine what they were after, and spent our money wisely, meaning you spent more money on the things that were important and against the most sophisticated adversaries. But today, most adversaries are sophisticated and most resources are very valuable. There's very little information that's not valuable. So it's very hard to take a risk-based approach to cyber defense. Everything's important and everybody's after it and they all have the best tools. So it's just bad news all around. It's almost throw your hands up and say, what do we do next? But I think there are some ways for us to catch up, and one of the most important, I think, is in how we design and implement our infrastructure, and having secure infrastructure is really the key, and having consolidation of tools and not having to manage tools or manage vendors and reducing the complexity of those tools is really the future of security, and we have to start moving in that direction, and that's where I think our investments need to be.
Yeah, it's exciting, and it's funny that technology may be our savior in the form of machine learning and artificial intelligence in the end, but we have a long way to go. George, what about you from the telco perspective? I mean, when I used to worry about security, it was mainly DDoS attacks, and now we're seeing the intensity of those up by an order of magnitude. But what else is on your mind in terms of threats to your infrastructure?
Well, what we're seeing from our customers really is almost a movement back to private networks. We're all talking about the internet and opening up the internet, but if you have mission critical operations and sensitive data like government and financial, unless you're really comfortable that that data is going to be protected, we're seeing a push back for private. And private, can come in different flavors. When we talk about private, we're talking about traffic that does not pass over the internet at all. We have some customers actually that put it in their contracts that their traffic shall not pass through the internet. Not even our management traffic as a network operator. We can't connect to our remote locations through the internet. So that, that's a challenge, definitely. Then when we're talking about access to the network, access to the physical sites, there's a whole other layer that you need to put on when you're dealing with security. It's not just access to the data. It's who's actually going to be touching that data, who's going to be touching that box, who's going to go into that government office to put in a router. So there's a whole layer of security in terms of clearances. What kind of back checks do you need to do on the employees, and how do you maintain that it's current? That you're not sending somebody in there that has a criminal background, or they even do credit checks for some that are dealing with financial institutions. Because if you're in financial difficulty, you may be more tempted to skim a little bit into your pocket. So that's what we're seeing in terms of private, private networks. And you can't go private everywhere, but some of these mission critical operations that need to make sure there's not going to be a security breach, or willing to pay a little bit extra to get that level of security.
Yeah, sort of back to the future. Laurent, you must see a lot in terms of all the customers you work with. What's your view of your customers in terms of how they're being threatened and attacked, and this new level of sophistication?
So we see this private network quite often, in fact, especially financial institutions. Stock exchanges is a good example. Universities as well have private networks, connect universities to each other. The problem here is, in the education side at least, is, the attack comes from within. So it's a private network that actually contains the attack into the private network, but they're actually attacking another participant that belongs to the same private network. So we've seen this one a few times. One of the I think defense that we see works quite well, or at least the area of research we're spending a lot of time on, is machine-to-machine protection using artificial intelligence and pattern analysis, as you mentioned. Very often, when the attack is very sophisticated, you actually don't fight someone. You fight another artificial intelligence that is changing its pattern and its behavior on the fly. And the only way you can protect this is to have the same tools. And so we spend a lot of time in pattern behavioral analysis using pattern recognition, machine learning techniques that are changing themselves based on the change of the attack surface, or the attack behavior, or the attack strategy on the other side. And in fact, you may not know this, but most of the things that happens today it's not someone. It's the most sophisticated one, at least. We are already in the machine-to-machine defense. And the human analyst is very important to make these algorithms evolve. But in many ways, they evolve by themselves. We don't even know. We don't even understand how they do it, how our algorithm change in front of the other sides change. This is why we call this artificial intelligence, obviously. But these are the area of research that we spend a lot of time on, is making the defense move at the same time as we see the attack move in every respect, to the point where we let the machine do its own thing, and trust in a way, which is weird to say, but trust in a way the artificial intelligence is able to change as fast as the other guy.
That's helpful. So Najam, how do we build a platform that allows a sort of layered defense? There's no cookie cutter for every customer, every network, but do you have a notion of a model or a technology spectrum that will work?
There are a number of things you have to do to build a defense model that is sustainable and learning over time. One of the things that we found was that no single platform or solution that you could buy from the industry would scale or be able to span the horizon that we cover or we wanted to cover. So we ended up building a lot of our systems internally. And the key principle there is that we're building security capabilities across the board in pretty much the entire layer of the infrastructure stack and all the way up to the application itself. But not just that, but the other thing that we're really focus on is that security is part of the entire fabric of Facebook, rather than security being a layer that a team implements in certain ways. So very simple human example of the first day you come into Facebook and you join as an employee, this will be really grilled into you. And even simple things like, hey, if you don't have any need to touch user data, do not go near the user data. If you touch user data and you didn't need to, you'll be walked out before your feet even touch the ground. This is a first day of orientation with a new employee coming in and getting that message. It's pretty shocking for people saying, oh my, I just joined the company. Instead of saying welcome, they say, do not go near the data, otherwise you'll be walked out in a minute. But that just sort of gets the message across in terms of how we think about security. It shouldn't be that security came in and said, hey, this is our policy, implement that. Everybody's involved. So every software system we're building capabilities in that will have detection capabilities to be able to collect data and essentially be able to analyze it. We'll do simple things like we're talking about what an employee might click on. So we run these campaigns called Hacktobers. And there's a team that just comes up with very creative phishing lures to get you to click on stuff. And employees sort of compete on who can identify the most Hacktobers. When you get an email from Mark saying, hey, or Mark's admin saying, hey, we're doing this new series about running lunch with Mark, so you're invited, click here to sign up. Would you click? Now, this is your CEO saying, hey, I'm running a new group call, to have lunch with employees. Most people would be like, yeah, click, let's do this. Oops. So there are things that you have to do that are just not obvious. It may not be technology, but it's making security as part of your normal everyday routine. So every system you're building starts out with the security architecture that makes sense, rather than you built a system and then you're going and saying, oh, okay, how do I secure this thing? That invariably ends up in the wrong space. So I could sort of go on in the list of things that we ended up doing. The trouble that we do have with this model is that we find it hard to find solutions from the industry that we can buy. They tend to be very narrow, very specific, and doesn't scale. The other thing that for us in terms of response of a security incident is that we want to be able to detect and mitigate very quickly. And when I say very quickly, we're talking within seconds. And anything you want to do in seconds, you can't have a human involved. So you have to figure out how you can detect in software and be able to mitigate it. And at times, mitigation requires you're taking devices offline, quarantining them. So you have to build platforms or ability to actually detect in software and mitigate and take a platform completely offline without a human getting involved.
Right.
And so for that, you end up essentially building your own systems that know the infrastructure really, really well.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I mean, Leo, the days of going to your favorite vendor, Cisco or HP, as a one-stop shop and just buying a security solution are over. What are your thoughts on that? The architecture that's needed and building a layered defense, building a platform versus buying boxes that quote unquote secure the network.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's getting very expensive to buy all these tools and manage them and maintain the headcount necessary to keep them running. So I think it's useful to look at what the adversary requires to do their job. And two of the things that you see common in every attack, and I haven't found one that doesn't have these two components, is the abuse of user credentials and the what we call lateral movement. That is moving from a lesser protected segment of the network to a sensitive part of the network. And when you think about those two components of an attack, denying those is transferring complexity and difficulty and expense to the adversary and better protecting yourself. So we are very focused on software-defined perimeter as a way to prevent those two steps. In the first part, software-defined perimeter as a specification, as an architecture, requires very robust authentication of the user, meaning not just username and password, not just even multi-factor, but context. And I think you're going to see more context being used to determine who is on the other end of the communication. It's not just packets that tell us whether that person has the username and the password, but where that person is, what type of device that person is using, the time of day, and all the things that should make a user more credible when presenting themselves to be privileged to a part of your network. So first part of software-defined perimeter, I think, in authenticating the user is very, very important. The second part is the ability to create micro-segments, and that is a trend that we really have to focus on. It's sort of going back to the basics. You only give someone access to a part of the network that they need access to, and what we have in the present architecture is on a VLAN. Once I have access to one resource on the VLAN, I theoretically and in most cases can send packets to everything else on that segment, and as a result I can explore other resources for vulnerabilities and eventually find one and escalate. So the ability to micro-segment, the ability to authenticate users robustly, and to do that with policy-driven automated engines rather than with traditional human-managed firewall rules, I think is really the way forward. We've focused on software-defined perimeter. We think that's a way to go as an architecture. We are deploying software-defined perimeter in our own environment, which has reduced some cost and complexity on our side. And we think that in terms of investment going forward, by reducing headcount, we're not only getting security benefit on the front end by making our network invisible, but we're also reducing the number of people it takes to manage this network. So there are some platforms out there, but I think, like you said, it's a basic change in how we architect. Instead of trying to use firewalls, VPNs, NACs, and other hard-to-manage legacy technologies, if you think about it, the stateful firewall was introduced in 1994. Forward almost 20 years, we're still trying to contort this tool to do what we needed to do in cloud and hybrid environments. So we need some native cloud tools and changes in architecture, and I think software-defined perimeter for us anyway, in terms of deploying it internally, is a platform that we find very promising.
Thanks, that was helpful. George, what technologies are you applying to the security challenge in your network or at the application level?
Yeah, I mean, the network that we deliver to our customers is it's managed Ethernet. It's generally a layer 2, so it's private to a point. The thing is that generally we're going through multiple network providers, so that's the challenge. There is you really need to know how your data is getting from point A to point B, because the weakest link is going to be one device maybe in a little remote community telco that is part of your path. So you really need to ask those questions. We talked a lot about trust your partners. I think you need to earn that trust. So until you truly understand the technology behind the services that we're buying as part of our solution, and the practices are secure, you really have to ask those tough questions. And a lot of it does come down to practices and processes as well. It's not just the technology. I mean, technology is changing so quickly. The devices that are out there in the network, there's constant updates and patches, and it's very easy to deploy a solution and forget about it for a while until there's a problem. Then you go back and say, oh yeah, well that software is 2 years old. So it's really important that you have really tight processes on managing your infrastructure and keeping them up to date.
Great, thank you. Laurent, I look at the cybersecurity market maps. I think you've seen the same, and there are thousands of vendors. And you're looking at that chart and you're wondering, how do all these pieces fit together? What's your perspective on the landscape, or the vendor landscape, and where you fit? But how does someone rationalize all these different applications and solutions, and talk about gateways and VPNs and firewalls to put together a complete picture?
Well, they don't. That's the problem. And so one thing, so I know I'm on the other side, but do not trust your supplier. Right? Do not trust your vendor, because he's going to say, oh, we take care of everything, don't worry about it. And then you find out, oh, but the perimeter is actually not what I thought it would be. And it's a nightmare when that happens, and we see this sometimes. Do not trust your vendor. Understand what they do and the perimeter of what they do. Another thing, and my colleagues say that very well, in software-defined or networks, or even in username and password, use what I call orthogonal defense. Orthogonal means that they are independent from one to the other. So it's a very good example with the username and password. Well, the context of what this user is doing has nothing to do with the knowledge of the password of that person. And so if you have a context analysis or behavior analysis that is independent from the knowledge of this guy has a right password, therefore he should be able to do anything he wants, then this orthogonalities or this independence between layers is what I think works, because it's very hard to crack. You crack one layer, you will not crack the other one, because the other one has nothing to do with the previous. So orthogonalities of defense, behavior-based analytic has nothing to do with an attack payload. You may have an attack payload that you will detect it there. It's kind of the antivirus, but for applications and networks, more sophisticated, I guess. But the behavior to get there is also what matters. And you catch him, or you catch the guy, whether there's an attack payload or whether there is a behavior, or by this combination of these two things that is really weird, this behavior I've never seen from this user, even though I know who this user is very well. One example we have is a very large bank in North America. And they have usernames and passwords. They have customers looking at their accounts. And they have these two-factor authentications. They know this user has been a customer for 10 years, therefore he should access his account, no problem. But then you find out, oh, well, his desktop was compromised, and it's not him moving the mouse. It's actually someone else. And how do you identify this? Well, it's a very orthogonal way of doing it. Is his port open? Are there other ports than port ATN 443 open on his machine? And if that's the case, then there is a higher degree of probability that he may be compromised. Therefore, I will increase my risk awareness for these users, even though I know him for 10 years. It's because of this orthogonal independent layer that you add on top of each other. Now, nobody has a clear way, and I'll stop here. Nobody has a clear way of, yeah, but am I protecting all my perimeters? And is there anything else open? Well, we don't know. That's why you cannot trust your vendor. You have to do this exercise yourself. But by adding independent layer on top of each other is usually a good practice.
That's very helpful. So we only have a few minutes left, but I would like to talk about, I think, what one of the biggest problems is in the industry, which is complacency. It's amazing to think that despite being in the newspaper headlines and the news headlines every day with breaches and attacks, there seems to be this almost acceptance of as the new norm, particularly within the executive suite or the boardroom. You don't really see many CEOs being fired for a data breach, despite massive implications. What's your thought about engaging leadership, management, the board, the CEO in these discussions, and how to really get them more aware and involved to this side of the business? Typically, something they know, fairly little about.
I'll take an easy shot.
Mark Zuckerberg not included.
Yeah, Zuck is very much into security.
Yeah.
But to me, the easy way is to, especially people who run security, is go hire a red team and have them attack your infrastructure, try to hack in. And when they do, show the data to your CEO, and if it doesn't freak them out, then you've got a problem. But most of the time, that's all it takes to get people to relay the message. Look, I've got all your user data here on a server outside your infrastructure, and that's all it takes.
So you really need that wake-up call. Leo, what does it take as an advisor working for CEOs to really get them informed, educated, sort of on the right track as far as cybersecurity goes?
Yeah, so it's hard to get CEOs and boards focused because security is not a core part of their business. It doesn't generate revenue in most cases. It is a cost factor. If not implemented properly, it can impact operations negatively. So it's not something people want to do a lot of naturally. What I think is changing is that boards and CEOs are responding to the consumer, whether they are business to business or business to consumer. More customers are becoming security aware and demanding security. So if you look at something like Department of Financial Services, cyber regulations that are issued, it's all about who you're doing business with should have certain security measures in place. And until the market, in effect, demands this type of quality in the service, meaning a security component, there's always going to be an eye towards making cuts and and minimizing security. So I think what's changing, and it's a positive thing, is that both individual consumers and businesses are demanding of their vendors more security in the products. And security is becoming more of a differentiator for some vendors, for most vendors. And as a result, the CEOs and boards will naturally, from a business case, focus on security. So as a security professional, you can talk till you're blue in the face and demand security and eventually wear out your welcome and be walked out the door. There's nothing more powerful than having the customer demand security. And I think that's the mindset that's changing, and that's what's going to change the attitude in the boardroom and in the C-suites.
George, obviously it comes down company to company, but what does your company think in terms of the importance of security in your plan?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I know our CEO is really big on security. It's a differentiator for our solution, and so we practice that internally as well. And I think the key really is to understand at the senior levels that security is not just an IT issue. It's an organizational issue that the whole organization has to rally behind. They have to understand the impact of a breach to the whole organization, not just lost data, but lost revenue, lost customers, brand damage. For every dollar that you put into being proactive, you spend $14 in being reactive and trying to fix the problem. So that's the challenge. But at the end of the day, it always comes down to you've got your IT budget, and it's always a certain percentage of your revenue, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge. But like you said, until there's a wake-up call, things don't change. But I know within our organization, we take it very seriously.
Well, good. It's good to hear.
We get the support.
And
yeah.
Laurent, what about you? I mean, you're obviously selling to the CSO, to the CIO, but do you have conversations with executive leaders as a vendor?
We do have this kind of conversation. Usually the chief security officer is a good contact for us. Some companies don't have one.
Yeah.
This is weird. Okay, so there's two kind of customers. There's one I call the security by design. So that's the Facebook of the world, and my colleagues as well, where they understand anything they do has to be secured, and it's built in when they are doing it, right? And then there are all the others. And for all the others, our best friend is the Wall Street Journal, really, is the news. Well, guess what happened to Target? Yeah, it could happen to you guys. What do you think about it? And then the last point I have is security does not have to be expensive. It's really funny how people think about this. It doesn't have to cost money that much. It's a few percentage on your IT budget. It doesn't need to be more than this. We see trends of building product, not just us, where security products are actually simple to use. Yeah, it used to be that security we just sell complexity. Oh, because it's a complex problem, it's an important problem. Therefore, it's so complex. You have to do all of these things that are very, very expensive. It's not the case anymore. Security, we simplify the function. We sell to companies who do not have a security practice. They have a CISO, they have the culture, but they don't have the 200 people team that Bank of America has. Security doesn't have to be expensive. And again, the Wall Street Journal is a best friend.
Well, thanks so much, panel. Really great panel and amazing insights. It's really rare to get so much experience right here on one stage. So thanks again.